The ministers of SCLC left Albany, but they took with them some important lessons that defined movement strategy for Birmingham.
The strengths of the Albany movement was it was perhaps the first time in this period of struggle of black people that we had mobilized an entire community against segregation. And secondly, we learned that valid and crucial lesson that you must pinpoint your targets so that you do not dilute the strength of your attack.
Coming out of Albany, which was what many people consider not a victory, they needed a victory. Dr. King's image at this time was slightly on the wane because he had not projected. I say, I assure you, if you come to Birmingham, this movement can not only gain prestige, but really shake the country.
SCLC's leaders accepted this challenge. They arrived in Birmingham in the midst of a campaign to replace Bull Connor and the other commissioners with a new form of government.
I'm pleased to have a cloud removed so the people of the city can get down to the very serious business of securing the very best men possible to man the new city government.
Regardless of what form of government we have, it is important that we put in office men who have records which show that they are not owned or controlled by anybody or by any group.
Bull Connor tried to keep power by running for mayor. But on April 2nd, 1963, he lost to Albert Boutwell, a racial moderate. The next day, SCLC launched Project C for confrontation.
Learning by the Albany circumstance, I targeted 3 stores. Pizzitz was one, I don't recall the other 2 stores now. And since the 16th Street Baptist Church was going to be our headquarters, I had it timed as to how long it took a youngster to walk down there, how long it would take an older person to walk down there, how long it would take a middle-aged person to walk down there. And I picked out what would be the best routes. Under some subterfuge, I visited all 3 of these stores and counted the stools, the tables, the chairs, etc., and what the best method of ingress and egress was.
Yes, we want a freedom. Yes, we want a freedom here. Yes, we want a freedom. We want to have freedom and we want it now. Yes, we want a freedom. Yes, we want a freedom.
21 demonstrators were arrested on the first day of protest. And the city of Birmingham discovered it had another problem. The outgoing commissioners announced that they had no intention of stepping aside for the newly elected government.
Well, I remember now the day we swore in the mayor, and before the day was over, we discovered we had 2 mayors, 2 city governments, and Dr. Martin Luther King and the SCLC starting marches up and down the street. The marches occurred almost entirely during the 37-day period when Birmingham had 2 governments. On Tuesdays, the commission met, proceeded to govern the city, and when they finished, they would march out and 9 council members would march in, and they would proceed to adopt laws and spend money and conduct the affairs of the city.
Until the courts could decide which city government was the legal one, Bull Connor remained in charge of the police and fire departments. And Connor took a lesson from Laurie Pritchett showing restraint as he supervised the arrest of hundreds of demonstrators.
Oh, Lord, I'm riding.
It was a week and a half before Easter. As planned, the demonstrations affected business during a major shopping season. Merchants and community leaders were upset.
We've got some mighty good people in this community, both white and colored.
Businessman A.G. Gaston supported the new administration.
We didn't anticipate the need for Martin King at that time. This Martin King thing came, and all of a sudden.
I was upset with Dr. King because he wouldn't give us a chance to prove what we could do through the political processes. And a year and a day after Connor had been elected with the largest vote in history, a majority of the people of this city voted to terminate his office. And when we ran for mayor, they rejected him.
I believe a representative of my office at the Department of Justice.
The federal government also thought the protests were ill-timed.
Birmingham, the fact that there was a change in administration in Birmingham, that the new administration had not yet taken over in their responsibilities and their duties, and that perhaps the timing of these demonstrations could be reconsidered.
On April 10th, Birmingham obtained a state court injunction ordering an end to the demonstrations. Dr. King grew discouraged, worried that the campaign here, as in Albany, would stall.
We had about 500 or 600 people in jail, but all of the money was gone and we couldn't get people out of jail. And the business community, black business community, and some of the white clergy were pressuring us to call off the demonstrations and just get out of town. We didn't know what to do. And he sat there in room 30 in the Gaston Motel, and Martin didn't say anything. And then finally, he got up and he went in the bedroom, and he came back with his blue jeans on and his jacket, and he said, look, he said, I don't know what to do. He said, I just know that something has got to change in Birmingham. I don't know whether I can raise money to get people out of jail. I do know that I can go into jail with them. And not knowing how it was going to work out, he walked out of the room and led a demonstration and went to jail. That was, I think, the beginning of his true leadership.
At this time, local white clergy were criticizing King and the campaign.
The ministers published in the newspapers a diatribe against Martin, calling him a troublemaker and saying that he was there stirring up trouble to get publicity. And he sat down and took that newspaper, and he had no paper, and he was in solitary confinement. And he started writing an answer to that one-page ad around the margins of the New York Times.
I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well-timed in the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years now, I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see with one of our distinguished jurists that justice too long delayed is justice denied.
As King sat in Birmingham jail, the demonstrations lost supporters. 8 days after his arrest, King accepted release on bond to plan the next phase of Project C. It would be the most controversial move yet.
We wanted to get the black community in Birmingham involved, and the way you get people involved is get their children involved.
They were taking the kids out of school, marching, and I thought that was unnecessary. In fact, my idea was the kids, many of them didn't know what it was all about to start with.
Most adults have bills to pay, house notes, rents, car notes, utility bills, but the young people, wherein they can think at the same level, are not at this point hooked with all those responsibilities. So a boy from high school, he get the same effect in terms of being in jail, in terms of putting pressure on the city as his father, and yet he's not, there's no economic threat on the family because the father's still on the job.
I'm on my way to freedom land.
Thursday, May 2nd was D-Day, the day the children began to march in Birmingham. At first, the groups were small. Policemen arrested them, loaded them in paddy wagons, and took them away to Birmingham jail. As the children continued to march in increasing numbers, paddy wagons became inadequate. Finally, school buses were brought in to gather the demonstrators.
If my mother don't go, I'll go anyhow. If my mother don't go, I'll go anyhow. If my mother don't go, I'll go anyhow. I'm on my way, oh Lord, freedom land. There is nothing you can do, to turn me around. There's nothing you can do, to turn me around.
By the end of that Thursday, 700 children were taken to Birmingham jail.
I'm on my way, oh Lord, freedom land.
Friday, more than 1,000 children stayed out of school and arrived at the 16th Street Church to march. Bull Connor tried to stop the marches before they began and brought out the city's police dogs. Next, the fire department was brought in and Bull Connor ordered water hoses turned on the demonstrators. With 100 pounds of pressure per square inch, the water hit with enough force to knock the bark off trees. As water pounded the demonstrators, David Vann was on the phone with A.G. Gaston.
And he was expressing a great deal of resentment about King coming in and messing up the thing just when we were getting a new start. And then he said to me, he said, but Lawyer Vann said, they've turned fire hoses on a little black girl. They're rolling that little girl right in the middle of the street now. I can't talk to you no more.
It was it, and stand up on my building looking down on Bull Connor and them shooting water in the park right across from my office there in that park. I guess that's the most outstanding thing in my mind right now. I just couldn't imagine what could happen.
Bull Connor's white tank patrolled the city streets as the fire hoses stopped the demonstrators. Some hid behind the trees of Kelly Ingram Park. Others frolicked in defiance. The conflict gained national attention, and news coverage of the event shocked the American public.
And it was a masterpiece of the use of media to explain a cause to the general public of a nation. Because in those days you had 15 minutes of national news and 15 minutes of local news. And in marching only one block, they could get enough news film to fill all of the newscasts of all of the television stations of the United States.
Photographs appeared in newspapers throughout the world, and the Birmingham story was told in many languages. The Russian newspaper Pravda ran a cartoon of police intimidating a black child. The federal government worried about America's image in other parts of the world. Governor Wallace saw it differently.
It seems that other parts of the world ought to be concerned about what we think of them instead of what they think of us. After all, we're feeding most of them, and whenever they start rejecting 25 cents of each dollar foreign aid money that we send to them, then I'll be concerned about their attitude toward us. But until they reject that 25 cents out of each dollar that Southern taxpayers pay for foreign aid to these countries, I will never be concerned about their attitude. In the first place, the average man in Africa and Asia doesn't even know where he is, much less where Alabama is.
On Saturday, the dogs and water hoses provoked angry responses from bystanders, some of them carrying weapons. Seeing the beginnings of violence, James Bevel borrowed a bullhorn from a nearby policeman.
So when I took the bullhorn and said, okay, get off the streets now. We're not going to have violence. If you're not going to respect policemen, you're not going to be in the movement, and, you know. So it's strange, I guess, to them. I'm with the police talking through the bullhorn, and giving orders, and everybody was obeying the orders. It was like, it was wow. But what was at stake was the possibility of a riot, and that once in a movement, once a riot break out, you have to stop. It takes you 4 or 5 more days to get re-established, and I was trying to avoid that kind of situation.
Monday, the 5th day of the children's campaign. Comedian Dick Gregory arrived in Birmingham and marched with the young demonstrators. Like hundreds before him, he was arrested. Law enforcement officials were working overtime to keep up with the arrest.
There was no such thing as off days. Everybody working 7 days, sleeping, catnapping, and just holding fire. We all had the confirmed belief that this couldn't go on for long because he was pressing the issue to the wall.
The confrontation moved outside the park. Once again, Bull Connor summoned his firemen. With no place to run, no trees for protection, the demonstrators were hit with the full force of the water. By Monday night, 2,500 demonstrators had been arrested, over 2,000 of them children. All jails in the city and county were filled.
At one time, I had, here in this building on the 7th and 8th floor, we had over 1,200 male juveniles, black, on top of our regular complement of probably near 1,000. At the same time, I had 600 female juveniles in the 4-H dormitory at the fairground.
Meanwhile, the Justice Department tried to move negotiations forward.
I participated in all of, in order to try to get some kind of agreement between people that often wouldn't talk to each other at all. I don't mean that the blacks wouldn't talk to anybody, but I mean there were many whites that wouldn't talk to any blacks, and there were many more whites that wouldn't talk to certain blacks, and there were no whites, I think, except for David Vann, who would talk to Martin King.
Tuesday, May 7th, fighting broke out between blacks and whites in the downtown area. Burke Marshall and the business leaders had just left the negotiating table for lunch. The situation was fast reaching the riot proportions James Bevel had feared. The businessmen quickly returned to negotiations, ready to talk.
And so we began analyzing, now, what are your problems, what are our problems? You've got to recognize, one, that we don't have a government. We've got 2 governments, neither of them can be effective. We've got to find a way to work this thing out within private sector formats.
Both sides agreed to a day of truce. A resolution was reached, but there was a last-minute hitch.
After we reached the settlement, and it looks like a molehill today to say that we're going to take down the signs, we have a 60-day cooling off period and desegregate lunch counters and begin a program of employment in downtown Birmingham with at least 3 clerks hired. I think somebody in New York asked Reverend Shuttlesworth why he would settle for just 3 clerks in downtown Birmingham, and he said, I meant 3 in every store. And the thing almost came unglued.
By that time, Reverend Shuttlesworth was so worked up that I can remember Fred cussing and David Vann crying. And it just seemed like when David Vann wanted to settle, Fred wasn't ready to settle.
Well, you must remember that there's always some disagreement when it looks as if you're not getting what you're aiming at. And there are people who want victories, social victories, to come quickly.
On Friday, May 10th, 38 days after Project C began, an agreement was reached with the business community. Reverend Shuttlesworth had been right. When the movement came to Birmingham, it won a much-needed victory. and it gained national attention. The next night, the Ku Klux Klan met outside the city, and Grand Dragon Robert Shelton gave this opinion of the Birmingham Agreement.
No business people in Birmingham or any other city has the authority to attempt any type of negotiation when it deals in governmental affairs of a municipality. Martin Luther King, in my opinion, epitaph can be written here in Birmingham.
Several hours later, a bomb exploded outside Martin Luther King's room at the Gaston Motel. King had already left Birmingham, and no one was in the room at the time. As a large crowd gathered, the Alabama State Police moved in and began beating blacks with clubs and rifles. In response, angry blacks rioted and set fire to several buildings. Over the next few weeks, the riots that began in Birmingham spread to other cities. Racial tensions gripped the country, and President Kennedy was moved to action. On June 11th, he took a stronger position than any president since Lincoln, calling civil rights a moral issue.
Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise. The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them. The fires of frustration and discord are burning in every city, north and south. Where legal remedies are not at hand, redress is sought in the streets, in demonstrations, parades, and protests, which create tensions and threaten violence and threaten lives. Next week, I shall ask the Congress of the United States to act, to make a commitment it is not fully made in this century to the proposition that race has no place in American life or law.
Kennedy pushed for a new civil rights bill, but was troubled when the movement announced plans for a mass march on Washington.